College, a role he's held since 2010, and it was part of my pleasure to invite Michael into that role all those years ago. He's been a member of the UK Task Force on Energy Efficiency, chaired the subgroup on industry, and advisor to the UK Board of Trade. He's a sought-after speaker, so it's great to have him here this evening. I know that he's going to give us a response to a previous lecture, which we're looking forward to hearing. He's already told me he's going to offend me, so I'm looking forward to your offense. But as Michael will do it, he will do it eloquently, elegantly, and with clear evidence. So I'm looking forward, Michael, to that. So it's really my pleasure and my privilege to invite Michael Liebreich to deliver the 2024 Energy Futures Lab annual lecture. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. And I will never offend. I was a bit worried because I may not say the nicest things about hydrogen, and you've been such a sort of powerful figure in that world. So that's the only way I think I could offend, potentially. So the background to this is actually the Masters in Climate Finance and Management. I've also been an advisor. That's Mirabelle's course. As an advisor, I was walking through the lobby, and it was full of people. And everybody said, you're here for the hydrogen talk. And I said, the what? Because I didn't know anything about it. And it was the Lord Mayor, Professor Michael Mainelli, was talking about hydrogen for the 18th Lord Ezra Memorial Lecture. And Lord Ezra, of course, was the chair of the Coal Board. So I thought that was interesting. We have the Lord Ezra Memorial Lecture, which is about hydrogen. And I spotted then this. Well, that's interesting as well. It was actually sponsored by one of the panelists we'll be hearing from is Kate Grinnell, who knows all about Cadent and probably has some thoughts on that as well. And so where's Leon DeMarco? Leon DeMarco was in that audience, and he went to the organizers and said, if you're going to have a lecture on hydrogen, you need to get Michael Liebreich to do some kind of a response, and that's the background here. So you'll see that what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about hydrogen. I'm going to structure it as a response to the remarks of the Lord Mayor back in March, and take, as you're going to see, probably a slightly different view. Now, hydrogen has mesmerized a lot of people for a long time. This is Jules Verne, and in a novel called The Mysterious Island, 1874 he wrote it, 1875 it was published. He said, water will one day be employed as fuel. Of course, I have a thermo background, not from such an eminent university as here, but only from Cambridge, sliding down the rankings. But nevertheless, that obviously is a slightly strange story. Water is going to be a fuel. Hydrogen, obviously something has to happen in between to get the fuel out of the water. But that's Jules Verne, 1874-75. This chap is John O'Mara Bockris, and he coined the phrase hydrogen economy. He was an electrochemist, and he spoke at GM, General Motors, and he said, one day your cars are going to run on hydrogen. He didn't call it water, he said hydrogen. He called it the hydrogen economy. And then some of us might remember this. There's a book by Jeremy Rifkin, The Hydrogen Economy, 2003, just when I was deeply unemployed as a result of the dot-com boom bust, which left me high and dry and unemployable. And this book summarized a lot of excitement about hydrogen around that time. And companies like Ballard Fuel Cells, share price, it was worth umpty billions. It was all terribly exciting, especially for an unemployed dot-com washout like me. And it had this very interesting thing. Look how mesmerizing this whole thing is. Of course, I checked out at this point. It sounds, because I'm not really interested in redistributing power on Earth. But the lure of hydrogen is incredibly powerful. It even lured a young doctor, a young chap called Michael Mainelli in the year 2004, who said, without moving almost wholly to renewable hydrogen power, significant climate change is unavoidable. Now, you could argue that significant climate change is unavoidable, but it won't be because we didn't move to renewable hydrogen power. And of course, Michael Mainelli is now the Lord Mayor of London and the person who delivered that 18th Lord Ezra Cadence-sponsored speech. Now, how's it going? Well, that's 150 years into the hydrogen economy. Electrolysis is churning out 0.1% of the hydrogen that's used around the world. It's about 100. There's some nice key figures, some heuristics that maybe will stick in your mind. 100 million tons. So it's 100 million tons of hydrogen, and since it costs about $1.50 on average to make, it's a $150 billion industry. That's not nothing. You know, it's sort of 3 times the size of the US food supplement business. So, you know, hydrogen is significant, and 0.1%. And by the way, if it's 0.1% electrolysis, that's not green hydrogen, that's just electrolysis hydrogen. Nevertheless, the state of hydrogen, sort of to the extent to which people have been mesmerized, there are now 56 countries with hydrogen strategies. Every self-respecting country has a hydrogen strategy. So you have, for instance, in Japan, actually the first country to have a hydrogen strategy and the first country after the oil shock to go all in on hydrogen. And you have the Prime Minister there shifting to and developing a hydrogen society. So hydrogen economy, hydrogen society, it's kind of the same thing, at least in my mind. It's critical for achieving decarbonization. There's Ursula von der Leyen, the EU. Hydrogen is the natural starting point. Now, one of the things that's kind of fun is I have a podcast called Cleaning Up. And I've had 160 guests or so, and the tagline is leadership in the age of climate change. And I've had all sorts of really extraordinary people come on. I've had everybody from the woman who glued herself to the Shell headquarters to the person who develops the Shell scenarios. I've had Tony Blair, I've had Tony Abbott. I try to get everybody in, and it's, you know, if you haven't listened, please do, because I have a lot of fun, and my co-host Bryony Worthington, who's now over on the West Coast, we try and get the best guests, and we try to challenge them. And a couple of the guests are in that picture. They're in the grey suit. That's Yorgo Chatzimarkakis, head of Hydrogen Europe. Fantastic episode. I strongly recommend you listen to it, or you can watch on YouTube. And just to the right, Marco Alvara, who's going to make a short cameo a bit later in this presentation. Germany, hydrogen, the gas of the future. And now we're starting to see, what does the hydrogen economy mean? You see there, you've got industry, heating, and fuels. Hydrogen society, hydrogen economy doesn't mean we'll just do a bit more hydrogen. This kind of industrial gas will grow a bit, we'll use it for a few things. It means we're going to use it, it's going to be pervasive through the economy. Right? Industry, heating, and fuels. And there's part of the thinking which is, because we'll use hydrogen for a few things, there's all this synergy and it'll sort of take off like digitization or electricity. Unpredictably, it's going to feed on itself, and we're all going to go hydrogen. It's going to be great. Scholz also said, we'll create a huge boom. And I normally don't show this because it's sort of almost irrelevant for what we're talking about, except that the Lord Mayor did show this photograph and said, well, only 36 people got killed. It could have killed 96, but it only killed 30. So I'm sort of obsessive about safety. You'll find that out as well. And I think Kate, whom I've worked with on a few safety issues, will know that. And you know, every self-respecting politician seems to have been mesmerized by this whole hydrogen thing. Now, this one's interesting. This is Jennifer Granholm, Secretary of Energy in the US, and she says it's the Swiss Army knife, right? Hydrogen economy, hydrogen society, and now we get the Swiss Army knife of zero-carbon technologies. And Bill Gates says some people refer to it as a Swiss Army knife. And I'm quite proud of this because I think he's talking about me. Because I've been using this. I actually stole this meme from a guy called Paul Martin, who does astonishingly good work. Paul, if you're watching this, thank you, at least for the meme, but also for your work. And the Swiss Army knife is fabulous. It's a great analogy because you can indeed do all sorts of things with clean hydrogen. Transport, heating, chemical feedstock, it's a building block for chemicals, all sorts of things. Land transport, air transport, everything. The problem is, the good news is the analogy is perfect. It's perfect because we've all got Swiss Army knives, right? And we don't do with them everything we could. So we don't cut our hair with them. We don't prune trees with them. I went to Japan. I said, you don't prune your bonsai trees with them. You don't butter your sandwiches with the little knife. There's no way you... Why? And the reason is there's almost always something cheaper, safer, and more convenient. Remember those three words: cheaper, safer, more convenient. The only time we really use a Swiss Army knife, either if it's cheaper, safer, more convenient, or no alternative at all. And hydrogen will play its role in the economy will be the same. It will only be used where it's cheaper, safer, more convenient, which it never is, or where there's no alternative. So let's start with cars, because that's the one that has mesmerized more people for longer than anything else. Those are battery electric vehicles. And you can see there the scale, 4 million per quarter. And drawn to scale, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And if you're saying there's something wrong with the presentation and I can't see it, no. Even in the front row, there are 0 pixels. That's how successful they are. I drew this first in, I think, 2017, and the blue chart, the scale was different. It looked the same. And I said, I will draw this. I'll keep it up to date. I'll do this for 10 years, as long as you want, and it will always look the same. Because the scale will keep going up, and whatever fuel cell vehicles achieve, you still won't be able to see them. I was asked, why do you hate hydrogen? I don't hate hydrogen. I don't have emotions towards elements on the periodic table, you know. But I've been right on that one. So this is actually, if you expand the no pixels visible, what you actually find is that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the sales are actually declining. How do you do that if you're a solution to climate change and the most promising technology, as we've heard? And one of the things is very interesting. Can you see there? South Korea, US, Japan, Germany, and other. Where's China? Because the Lord Mayor says, today China has the highest number of hydrogen fueling stations for road vehicles worldwide. You can fill up almost as you would with petrol or diesel. That's what he said. There is a Chinese fuel cell car. It's called the Zhejiang long something, lots of letters, HS something something else. Not a single one was sold for the first 6 months in May 2023. It was launched in 2022. Now, there are some fuel cell trucks in China, I think about 6,000. So you can restate that chart. But it's in the pixels that you can't see, all right? It's noise. Now, fuel cell hydrogen fueling stations are being dismantled. All the Shell hydrogen stations in the UK were shut. Then you've got these ones, which are California stations, shut. Denmark, the stations were shut. Nevertheless, Toyota is giving 500 fuel cell Toyota Mirais to the Paris Olympics to drive the athletes around. Now, probably they're organizing fueling through Air Liquide completely separately, but right now there are 9 fueling stations in Paris, of which 2 are actually working. Buses. Here you've got the very high-profile launch of hydrogen buses, 2019, and the French city that pioneered it will in future be using EVs. I was on the board of Transport for London. We had some fuel cell buses because at that time we were still in the EU and they gave them to us, and management used them as an excuse not to dive into electric buses. It was predatory delay. You had some hydrogen buses, so you could sort of say, well, we need to study them. We can't make decisions, which is why London today only has about 1,000 electric buses out of a fleet of about 8,500. We are way behind the curve. Why? Part of the reason was the delay caused by the hydrogen buses. Trains, very, very promising hydrogen trains, and again, the launch of trains. And this is a pattern that you'll see going across the world. You'll see some mayor, some council gets excited, finds a pot of money, assembles some funding, goes for some trains, goes for some buses, and a few years later they disappear, which is why Ballard, which has been around for 44 years, has done nothing but burn through capital. And by the way, Plug Power, ITM, all of the other ones as well. Hydrogen production, despite being awarded millions in state funding, once pioneering green hydrogen project has been scrapped. Green ammonia, vast green ammonia plant in Geismar, Louisiana, scrapped. Hydrogen imports via liquid hydrogen, scrapped. There is a spot of light, though. There is one sector where fuel cells rock, and it is forklift trucks. There's 25,000 forklift trucks powered by hydrogen fuel cells. It's the future. Now, the good news is you can see the pixels, right? You can actually see, at least if you're in the front. The point being that 25,000 forklift trucks is nothing. We have to be serious here. What you've actually got is 2 million electric forklift trucks sold. And I think, by the way, the 25,000 is cumulative. Matt, where's Matt? Matt, we need my analyst, my assistant. We need to work on this. Because I think that the 25,000 that the mayor is talking about is cumulative. Right? And these are actual sales. So they are probably, they are invisible, largely. Right? That's the best sector that you can come up with. Now, despite all of this, because of all the excitement and attention and 56 hydrogen strategies around the world, there are lots and lots of projects, all looking for this. The mountain of carrots. It's not a hydrogen economy, it's a hydrogen carrot economy. Production of hydrogen subsidized, transport of hydrogen subsidized, distribution subsidized, usage subsidized, overall lots of money, finance available, policy supportive. I've counted 24 different sorts of subsidies and support mechanisms. And of course, renewable energy had some subsidies and supports as well, but not 24, and you couldn't layer them. And we're going to learn about what layering subsidies means. Despite all of this, number of projects. 1,600 projects, 14% have got through to some sort of investment decision by number of projects. When you do it by the volume of hydrogen, it's 1%. In other words, the little projects, those cute little trains and buses that don't really work, they're getting approved. But the big projects that could actually perhaps move the needle on the climate, they're not even getting approved. They're not getting funded. 1%. And blue hydrogen, of course, that's natural gas with the CO2 taken out, 7% have been approved. The electrolyzer industry has built capacity to deliver 54 gigawatts worth of electrolyzers per year. The orders this year are going to be 4. Also, something like 7% capacity utilization. And red, they're all bleeding red. I should say they're all still bleeding red because they've been doing it for decades. Now, the question that we have to ask is why? Huge aspirations, mountain of carrots, lots of projects, and nothing happening. Why? So I was at McKinsey. Right, McKinsey is intimately bound up with it. When there's the history of hydrogen is written, there'll be a whole chapter for McKinsey for their work with the Hydrogen Council, generating a lot of the excitement, working on a lot of the strategies. So I was at McKinsey, and I learned to do an arrow across the top of charts. if we're going to use hydrogen, we need to produce it, get it to where it needs to be, wholesale, maybe store it, get it right out to the users, and then the users have to do whatever it takes to use it. And the problem is, it's expensive to produce, it's expensive to transport. Storage, small scale, is certainly expensive. Large scale, we haven't done yet. It's expensive to distribute, and it's expensive to use unless you already use hydrogen for fertilizer or petrochemicals. And we're going to dive into a few of these and have a look at them. So, production. The first thing to realize is if you want to do green hydrogen for anything, the demand, the scale of it is gargantuan. This is the biggest project in the world, NEOM, in Saudi Arabia. It cost $8.5 billion. You know, if you did it again, you could halve it, whatever. But the point is this, look what it produces. 100 million tons, remember? 100 million tons. And this thing produces 0.22 million tons. 0.2% of the global hydrogen demand. You've got to do 500 of these gargantuan things that take several years to build, and you could only meet current hydrogen demand. 500 of them. If you start looking at it the other way, you look at the volumes needed to do anything meaningful on the user side, then you find that if we were going to do steel, you would need to use 134% of all of the wind and solar that has been built in the history of the economy. Everything you see, every wind farm, every solar plant, you need to use 1.3 times that just to do steel. But if you want to do aviation via e-kerosene, and there's some fantastic companies trying to do that, but you would need 190%, nearly twice all the wind and solar in the world. For the shipping industry, 154%. But you're trying to do all of these, right, to move the needle on climate change. Gargantuan volume is required. Now, all of these strategies, all these national hydrogen strategies written by all these highly paid consultants, they all had one thing in common. They were all predicated on cheap hydrogen. Not just lots of it, but cheap. And here you see, again, thank you to Matt, who's been slaving away trying to pull these numbers out of documents for days and days. And you can see they all are predicated on getting close to $1 per kilo. Why? Because right now, hydrogen costs $1.50, $1 in the US, in the Gulf, a bit more in Europe, average it out. But you'll target, all of these hydrogen strategies target the $1 mark. Well, where are we? How are we doing? Sadly, for those who are supporting hydrogen, we're now getting some data. That's where it is. The reason there's a horizontal line is you kind of, you finance these things over a 10-year or more offtake. So the dot is the beginning, is when they won the contract or when the data comes from, and then the 10 years after that. And that's where we are. The real cost of hydrogen today is more like $6 to $13 per kilo, green hydrogen. Now, of course, the mayor's background is a very solid background as a technologist and a futurist and an economic technologist, if you like. And he quite rightly points out that learning curves, the experience curve, is the right way to think about this. And I spent my career calculating them. And he says that for electrolyzers, they're reasonable, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen it. Solar modules, wind turbines, batteries, these experience curves. I built New Energy Finance because I realized the experience curve would make these viable technologies. So I'm absolutely with the Lord Mayor on the importance of the learning curve. Here's where it goes wrong, though. These things have got different learning curves. Solar modules, 28%. Why? Because it's just material science, like a flat-screen TV. Batteries, there's some chemistry involved. There's also a lot of material science. But wind, 15%. Why? much more heavy engineering, steel and copper and windings and stuff like that. Building big concrete platforms for the foundations and so on. So when you look at, there's some very good data from a research organization called TNO in Holland. This is a Dutch example. Then you see that their average levelized costs from about 20 projects that they were given confidential data by real people who are building these things, average was €13.70 per kilo. But look how it's made up. 38% of it is electricity. So we're looking for an order of magnitude reduction in cost from €13.70 to about €1.37 would be nice, right? But 38% of that is electricity. Does anybody think that electricity is going to go down in cost by 10x between even now and 2050? Because I certainly don't. Will solar continue to get cheaper? Will wind? Yes, okay, will. But 10x? No way. You can also expand out the unit capital cost. The stuff at the bottom, that's the capital cost down at the bottom. And the problem is that those electrolyzers that the Lord Mayor rightly points out will become very cheap only account for 11% of the cost of this average of Dutch projects. And a lot of the rest is what I call engineering stuff. So you can now see why I got the visiting professorship, right? You know, because I know the terminology. But it's things like compressors and pipes and flanges and heat exchangers and the infrastructure, the civils, the substation for the electricity, all that stuff. Are we going to get a 10x drop in that cost? People are looking at 2030. 2035, they're sure the hydrogen will be cheap. You think we're going to get a 10x drop in that stuff by 2035? Good luck. So, transportation. This is wholesale transportation. So we're going to get coal, gas, and oil, which currently drives 36% of shipping is coal, gas, and oil, by the way. As we go clean, we will get rid of that shipping. We will recycle those ships. It's incredibly exciting. But the Lord Mayor says, no, 18%, half of it will remain because it'll be shipping around hydrogen and its derivatives. So let's do a little bit of physics. That's what 150 kilos of steel, water, and diesel look like. And that's what 150 kilos of liquid hydrogen look like. I've had stand-up arguments about the likelihood of shipping liquid hydrogen around the world in volume with people who couldn't tell me the density of liquid hydrogen. Now, the Lord Mayor, knowing that I'm skeptical, not skeptical, I have ruled out, I've said there will be in the energy system no more than homeopathic amounts of liquid hydrogen used for anything. And he says, it's a little difficult to argue with a Kawasaki engineer with a huge budget behind him and tell him that you have probably not thought this through properly. Now, I think the key words there, by the way, is engineer with huge budget. So, first of all, we know engineers can make any of this stuff work if you give them a huge enough budget. But I just think that hearing the words engineer with huge budget makes me happy. But this is, on the left, something called a QMAX, right? That's what an LNG carrier looks like. They're big. And you can see there, 266,000 cubic meters. So the only liquid hydrogen that has sailed the seas is in a ship called the Suiso Frontier, which was 1,250 cubic meters, or 0.2%. Everything in hydrogen is 0.2% what you'd like it to be. But it's also a really expensive ship because its cargo has to be kept at 20 Kelvin, which of course is not possible, and so you can see at the bottom it boils off. This ship sails around under a plume of hydrogen, at least if it can't use it in its own engines. So now we're going to scale that up. Kawasaki, the engineer's got a huge budget. After all, why not? There's the concept ship. And it's still a lot smaller than the one on the left, and that can be dealt with, of course. But just this one if you just sailed around with one of those, you would need 4 times as many ships as the big one on the left that's doing the LNG. But not only that, because liquefaction of hydrogen is so energy intensive, you need to make 6 loads and spend 2 of them getting the thing to be liquid for the other 4. But wait, there's more. Remember that boil-off, 1% a day. So you're going to sail 20 days, so you're going to lose 20%. So of those 4 loads that you did liquefy, guess what? You need 1 more ship. Well, you're only going to arrive with 3, or if you want 4 where you arrive, you better start with 5. Now, it's not just me saying this. This is a piece of analysis by, very good analysis by the Austrian Institute of Technology, because they looked at how do you get all this hydrogen to Europe, right? Europe has a problem. It's an energy-intense economy. We import energy. Austria has a primary steel industry, right? And they're under huge pressure to stop doing what they're doing right now, which is continuing to buy Russian gas. So this is very good analysis. But what you can see there's the price up the left. If you want to get your hydrogen for 3 to 12 euros per kilo, remember, still more expensive than the 1.5 or the €1 that you're aiming for, the only way to get it via imports is via pipeline. The only way. So they agree, shipping, look at the numbers, are simply uneconomic. Catastrophic, by the way, for the European economy if we really did try to do this. Now, of course, all of the aficionados say, well, you know, Michael's just taking, he's gaslighting us. He's gaslighting. It's a straw man. We're never going to import liquid hydrogen. We know that. We're going to do ammonia. Then we're going to turn it back into electricity. And they can cite all those projects that you saw. Lots of them are about ammonia. We're going to do ammonia from Canada. Chancellor Scholz, Justin Trudeau, they signed an agreement. They said it's a hydrogen agreement, and then they had to do spin and reputation management. Say, no, he meant ammonia. Japan, they're going to be co-firing with ammonia. This is the sort of process diagram, and you don't need to understand or follow much of it at all, though of course you do, because this is Imperial, second best university, or best university in Europe. All you need to know is this: end-to-end efficiency, 20%. So if you start with Canadian wind, 5 units, only 1 arrives. Now, I didn't study economics, but I know that that's likely to mean that the electricity is at least 5 times more expensive when it arrives, given that you're throwing away 80% of it. But that only works if there's no maintenance and capital is free. So call it 10 times, call it 7 times, make up a number. But if Europe has to rely on this, it's also catastrophic. But of course we can do methane. We can do e-methane. Another of these diagrams, again, you don't need to get into the detail. It's even worse. E-methane, capturing carbon from the air, water, electrolysis, put them together, compress it, LNG ship, gasify it, turn it back into electricity, stand under a shower, just throwing away $20 bill, 20-pound notes, whatever you want to do, anything you can do is essentially going to be as economically efficient as this. Now, why do people talk about e-methane? And we're going to get back to Mr. Alvera, Marco Alvera, who was in that photograph with Ursula von der Leyen right at the beginning. And the reason is the US Inflation Reduction Act, that so many people think we should simply cut and paste and copy, allows you to hoover up, layer subsidies. You get subsidy for producing renewable electricity, subsidy for turning it into hydrogen or using it to electrolyze hydrogen, subsidy to capture carbon, and if you do import it into Europe, you then get an exemption from the EU ETS. But there's more subsidies because the solar panels might be made in a factory that benefits from IRA, or you might benefit from the Infrastructure Act in the US. So the total subsidies, just the direct, just the absolutely easy to identify ones, $75 per million BTU. Is that a lot? Natural gas in the US today is trading at about $2 per million BTU. $2 is the value of the commodity. Now you say, well, hang on a second, but we want it clean and we want it in Europe. So it's about $7 in, no, it's probably, I think it's $10 in Europe right now. And then you can add a carbon price, so it's clean. You get to $14. In Europe, clean natural gas, $14. $75 of direct subsidies via this route. So of course it's attractive. Of course there'll be projects. Of course there'll be lots of excitement. Why wouldn't there be? And Mark Oliver came on my podcast. I think he was going to persuade me that this was real, that this was a thing, that I should support it, we should be excited. And he even said the quiet part out loud. There's a lot of money to be made in layering all the different subsidies. He's a carrot farmer. You get a subsidy for capturing CO2, you get a subsidy for producing renewables, you get a subsidy for producing hydrogen, and guess what? You can export that molecule to Europe or to Japan. Is that really how we're going to deal with climate change? So anyway, storage. Small scale, we deal with energy storage. We have familiar ways of storing energy in our lives, things like gas cylinders or batteries. The hydrogen you can store, you've got 700 bar. An aqualung is at 200 bar, but it also doesn't have the nasty characteristics of hydrogen and brittlement and so on. It's basically, you can do it, it's expensive. The large scale is really interesting because when it comes to keeping the lights on when there's no wind and no solar, so there might be no wind for a few weeks in winter and there's very little sun, it's a really difficult challenge. And hydrogen there is one of the promising things. And luckily, there's a number of ways that we could store either hydrogen or a derivative. And this is genuinely promising area to work on. But if we're going to do it, my McKinsey arrow I'm going to use again. Because what we have to find is a large-scale storage pathway that satisfies all the criteria. These are systems problems. There's no point whatsoever in solving a little piece of the problem. We've got to solve the whole of the problem. And in the case of storage, it means we've got to be able to produce the hydrogen or the derivative. We've got to be able to move it to where it's needed, store it, get it back out, and generate electricity with it. And so there are a few promising ways of doing that, but there are none of them that are perfect. And none of them are cheap. So if we're going to do this, and I think we will end up doing this, we better do it as little as possible. As little as possible, because it's going to otherwise drive up our energy costs enormously. Distribution. How many people knew this? There's all these people saying, oh, well, hydrogen trucks, or we're going to, we're going to do a heating trial in Ellesmere Port, and we can't get the hydrogen, but we can truck it in. One diesel truck to get it off the road, if you're using hydrogen, so one tanker of diesel gets replaced by 18 tube trailers. That means that if you're the mayor of a town or you're a council, you've got 18 times as many deliveries to your petrol station. Now, blending always comes out, and I have no other way of explaining it other than that it's the stupidest thing from Stupidville. And the reason is, you've done all that work making hydrogen, and the UK hydrogen auction cleared at a price, not of the 13.70 that we heard about from Holland, but it cleared at a price of 9.27 per kilo. And the first thing you do when you blend is reduce that hydrogen to its heat value, which means you destroy 88% of its value. And by the way, then you sort of charge everybody who didn't want hydrogen, like every little bakery, you charge them because somebody's got to pay for this, right? So then you get the suggestion that, wait a minute, because we have curtailed wind, there's all this energy being lost, wasted. So surely we have to do something with it. And that's curtailment from the average UK wind farm, 5%. It's going up, and it will double in the next few years because we're building so much offshore wind. But the worst UK wind farm, something like 30%, let's say. But here's the thing. When you go from that wind electricity to hydrogen and back to electricity, you're wasting 70% of it. That's equivalent instantly to curtailment of 70%. So why would you do that? But it's actually worse than that. The Scottish minister, energy minister, said we should be using this curtailed wind for heating. So hang on a second. Let me take that wind, let me curtail whatever percentage it is, and then let me put the small remainder, whatever it is, into a heat pump. Greg, probably an octopus heat pump. And let's compare that to making hydrogen, pumping it around the country, and then putting it into a boiler. The break-even curtailment for that ludicrous route, ludicrous pathway, is 87%. In other words, as long as you get 13% of your electricity surviving curtailment, when you multiply it by a coefficient of performance, it beats the hydrogen, which you then have to, well, the electricity to hydrogen, to compression, to putting it in a boiler, and both of them come out at about 50%. 50% of the original electricity ends up as heat in your front room. 87% curtailment. I mean, it's going to get bad. Daily Mail is going to go nuts when we reach 10% curtailment, right? But not anything like 87%. So, usage. Now, you've got two different categories. You've got people who already use hydrogen, and of course, they could just use clean hydrogen. Fertilizers, petrochemicals. But where it gets really expensive is when it's new uses. Why don't we use those cars? Well, setting aside the sort of upstream stuff about efficiency, which I think we've already dealt with, the fact is hydrogen fuel cell cars, and this is where I might offend Nigel, so close your, don't listen, la la la, they're worse cars. Look at the one on the left, hydrogen, the one on the right, look at the number of parts, look at the complexity. Right? You can't fold the seats down because it's full of hydrogen canisters. It doesn't accelerate as well. It needs more maintenance. If you want to take a fuel cell out of a Toyota in a garage, the manual for how you do that is 280 pages long. Because it starts with, first vent your hydrogen. And you only get to a spanner on about page 30. There is a reason in physics for this. By the way, nobody should say that generative AI isn't changing the world. Look at that. It's changed my life. Actually, Matt. I can't see where Matt is. Matt's in the room, but he did this. It's fantastic. ChatGPT. There we go. There we go, Matt. Well done. That's great. ChatGPT. But engineers are brilliant. Engineers with big budgets are even more brilliant, right? And you could get an engineer with a big enough budget to make a Formula One steam-powered car. It wouldn't win any races, though. And the reason it wouldn't is it's the wrong powertrain, it's the wrong system, it's the wrong fuel. And so to pretend that we got cheap solar, so we must get cheap hydrogen, it's kind of equivalent to saying, we broke the speed of sound, so we'll break the speed of light. They're just different. Now, the Lord Mayor, to whom I'm responding, was very excited because last year Kawasaki unveiled the first hydrogen-powered motorcycle prototype. On this, he is simply incorrect because there's the Kawasaki, and there was this. Some people here will remember Intelligent Energy. And they had a fuel cell motorbike, hydrogen fuel cell motorbike, and that in the middle is, because it was so long ago, is Gordon Brown helping to launch it. And there's a reason why it didn't succeed. It's a bad motorbike, all things considered. Now, hydrogen trucks, Everybody's still excited about hydrogen trucks. Except, this is Patrick Pouyanné, and he was giving testimony under oath to the French Senate. And under oath, of course, he had to actually tell the truth. Perhaps more people in the hydrogen world should give testimony to the Senate. We decided to invest in a European network of hydrogen filling stations for HGVs. But I'm not sure we got it right. Now, what happens is everybody's very concerned about the weight of hydrogen vehicles, the weight of hydrogen trucks. They think this is a showstopper. The thing is, when you take a truck and you take out the engine and you take out the gearbox and you take out the differential and you take out the diesel tank and you take out the exhaust system and you take out all the stuff that's to do with managing vibrations, not all of it maybe, you end up with a truck that's about a ton heavier. And sure enough, all of the major manufacturers of trucks are launching electric trucks. And up there, Pragma Charge is a company that I have incubated to provide charging for them. Heating. Kate's excited now. This is yours. Okay, hydrogen heating. So this is the hydrogen-ready boiler that's being marketed so heavily by the UK gas industry. What they don't tell you is this. The only safety protocol for a hydrogen boiler in the UK involves knocking a 4-by-4-inch hole in the wall of every room with a hydrogen appliance or significant pipework. That's what HSE says. And engineers who've worked with hydrogen will tell you why. But this is not new news. This is something I discovered, actually. The world's first hydrogen safety regulations from 1824 also said you need continuous ventilation independent of the will of the workers there employed. The workers there employed, by the way, is me in my kitchen if I have a hydrogen hob. Now, a few years ago, there was a report into how much it would cost the UK to move to hydrogen heating. It was H21 North of England report, and it concluded, well, it's only a 6.6% increase in bills. The number went viral. It's all over the place at the time. But what they did was they took 3.8 million households in the north of England, converted them to hydrogen, and spread the costs over all 28 million homes in the UK. I don't know which consultancy they used, but I don't consider that legitimate. Now, if you go to page 448 of the same report, you discover something very interesting. An actual breakdown per unit, the cost of hydrogen. And you discover that actually it drives up the cost of the fuel by a factor of 2. Your utility bill would double if we all moved to hydrogen. And here's the most interesting thing about this report. It's also sponsored by Cadent. Hydrogen air travel is back, sure. The problem is not even the aeroplane. The problem is actually how you get liquid hydrogen to an airport. There are 2 solutions, lots of power to liquefy it in at the airport, or you could bring it in via trucks. Courtesy of Matt and ChatGPT, we have 2 options for the future design of Heathrow, for real. Now, I pulled all this together in the famous hydrogen ladder, which many of you will have already seen. There's some things at the top we have to use clean hydrogen for. There's some other things we'll probably use it for. We've talked about long-duration storage, steel, and so on. If we did all of that, if there's anybody here who thinks we can do all of that with green hydrogen alone, it would take 6 times all of the wind and solar ever built. Now, in Abu Dhabi, COP28, we decided we would triple capacity by 2030. So if you just want to do the top 2 rows of the hydrogen ladder, all of the new build, all of the existing, all of the new build till 2030, times 2, is going to go just to decarbonize those 2 rows. No clean heating, no clean transport, no decarbonization of the grid, no clean industry, just that. That's why I've made peace with blue hydrogen. because I consider that to be a bad outcome for the planet. Now, there's also some things at the bottom. I call that the row of doom. I think we've talked about most of it, and some things that are almost certainly going to go the way of the row of doom. But I want to leave you with a final upbeat thought, because this does not mean that things are hopeless. Because what is astonishing, while everybody is talking about hydrogen, and I was at the FT Hydrogen Summit yesterday, so much talent, so much attention, so much political capital, so much money, hundreds of billions that have been committed. Meanwhile, we're faced by 4 fantastic opportunities. Electric transportation, electric heat pumps or electric space heating, electrification of industry, all of which, by the way, will help to absorb more variable renewables because they can also be demand responsive. And then if you're just interested in opportunities, machine learning, data centers, they will both help, machine learning will help us to manage this complex system that we're going to, but they also present huge challenges. But if you want something interesting and promising for the climate to work on, look no further. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thanks very much. So we're now going to have a short panel discussion. So if I could invite our panelists to these comfortable seats at the front, that'd be lovely. And Michael will be part of that. But we're just going to ask each of our panelists, so I'll briefly introduce in a moment, to say a few words in response to what they have just heard, and then we'll open up. So let me go in the order in which they've sat here. So this is Greg Jackson, is the founder of Octopus Energy Group. Launched in 2016, the group serves 7.7 million customers across 18 countries and operates a £7 billion portfolio of renewable energy assets. So, Greg, welcome. Kate Granell has been at the forefront of one of the UK's planned hydrogen trials, so she's been living the dream, as it were, and has a wealth of experience when it comes to this really important aspect of how communities and people engage with new technologies. And I know that you have some interesting comments to make to us, so we're looking forward to hearing that. And finally, my colleague Tim Green. So Tim is a professor of electrical power engineering, fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and works on energy systems. He works on power systems. He's also our academic lead for sustainability here at Imperial. So Tim, welcome. So perhaps I could go in the order in which I introduced you. So Greg, would you like to go first, and just a few immediate reflections from you, if you don't mind.
I mean, the first one was that was brutal. I mean, genuinely, devastatingly brutal. But so not to, if you like, add anything to that, but to come from a couple of other perspectives. The first is, we should ask ourselves, why has society fallen so heavily for this hydrogen story? And I think it's, look, we all grew up, the last 150 years of human prosperity have come about from burning stuff. Almost every major end use of energy involves burning something. And so when we look at cars, they burn something. When we look at heating systems, they burn something, and so on. And so we asked the wrong question. We didn't say, how do we move about? How do we keep warm? We said, what should we burn next? That was the wrong question. I think it's exacerbated because most of the people, for example, that Michael was, the work that was being brutally taken apart there was from organizations and individuals that do not talk to consumers and customers and don't understand those end users. So let me talk a little bit about that. First of all, I mean, we're lucky enough, we serve 7 million people directly in the UK alone, 1.5 million more overseas, with energy. And we've asked ourselves always, what would happen if we'd never had fossil fuels in the first place? Because people are pretty inventive. We would have created solutions that enable us to live the life we live today just without the climate change, and by the way, without the 10 million deaths a year that occur from local air pollution, and all of the other negative externalities of fossil fuels. And And so the question you say is like, how would you run on a purely electrified society where most of that electricity comes from renewables until we've got something better? Michael mentioned a few times there variability and volatility. What we found is fascinating is that if we give consumers price signals, we give them cheap electricity when it's windy and sunny, they don't consider that a negative. Right? It isn't true that they just want to switch the lights on. They want cheap power. And no one's ever had the opportunity for cheap power before because we build this system that's the equivalent of flying planes with just one person sitting in them and charging accordingly. But when we give people a chance for a bargain when it's windy and sunny, you know what? It's not everyone wants to do it, but I think 50% of all of our customers with a smart meter do it. And in return, they get cheaper power. But in doing so, they also make it cheaper for everyone else because we don't need to worry so much about filling the gaps. There's less demand at times when there's less supply. And we take this further, you know, like if you've got an electric car, you can just plug it in when you get home, and we will optimize the charging. Typically based around when it's windy and sunny and, you know, when the grid's empty. People doing that pay 7 times less per mile today than those that drive diesel and petrol cars. I.e., the consumer benefits of renewable power are phenomenal. Even more so because unlike any of the fossil fuels, electricity is fungible. It goes both ways. Now, when people have got an electric car that we can discharge back into the grid or the house, we give them 13,000 miles a year of free driving because we can fill the battery up with cheap electricity off peak, empty that onto the grid at peak, and then with money we've made, refill the battery with cheap electrons for driving. I just use these as examples that our failure as a society to imagine the better world that is available now that we have plummeting prices for wind and solar and batteries and all of the other technologies is the reason that we're pursuing this complete white rabbit. And I'll tell you why it matters to me. A few years ago, I was sat, our company was growing, and I read an article. I was sat outside a tent. I read an article that said, it describes us as a clean energy company. I was so proud. But I knew that even then we were selling gas to 1 million households. Today, we're the second biggest seller of gas to households in the UK. And I thought about just stopping selling it because I couldn't live with that secret that we were a terrible emitter when we were meant to be a clean energy company. But of course, people still needed to heat their homes. And we began the process of looking at how do you heat homes without gas. And we put, you know, really good engineers on this question. And it became apparent that as Michael spoke there, you know, you take 6 to 8 times more electricity to create the green hydrogen to heat a home than if you use a heat pump. I'm sure you all know that heat pumps generate 3 kilowatts of heat for every kilowatt of electricity they use. 4 kilowatts if they're ground source. 5 kilowatts if they're water source. It is mad that we pursue these paths. And I think Mike was right to be grumpy because what we heard about those London buses that delayed the investment in the right solution. This is the equivalent of we're sailing on the Titanic, we ain't got enough lifeboats to begin with, and then most of the people that should be getting passengers on the lifeboats are fucking around playing instruments, and we're all going to drown. Oh, sorry for the language. I am so sorry.
It's before 9 o'clock. This is a family-friendly show. Okay. You'll never hear language like that at Imperial College. That's all I'm saying.
I'm so sorry. I went to Cambridge, which apparently is like, you know, a bit rough these days compared to you lot.
Okay.
Thank you. I've got the second impossible task of following Mike and Greg, so you've got the next impossible task. But so thank you for having me. So I'm Kate Grinnell, as mentioned before. So I was, I suppose, spearheading the campaign within Whitby, Cheshire. We were selected and chosen to be the first recipients of a trial area to use hydrogen for domestic heating. As some of you may or may not know, it did not go to plan. Thank you. So it was a really, really difficult journey. I won't go into it too much, but I think Michael and Greg have both touched on it. Is the consumer is so far from people's thoughts. You know, this is all. You know, I'm a member of the public, effectively. This is business. This is big business and big money. But what we're forgetting is the consumers are at the end of it. And if you have not got them on board and you have not co-designed and you have not engaged them and you have not brought them along on the change curve, then we've shown that there is going to be a huge, huge barrier quite rightfully so, as Michael's or Matt's analytics have demonstrated, we could see quite early on that the efficiencies and the price points were not something that we would want to open the gateway to. I could sit there and, we were effectively offered lots of money to take these opportunities, but we saw it as a complete misdirection and misuse of public funds. We saw it as a Trojan horse project, and again, we've used the terminology before, white rabbit, white elephant. It just made no sense to us, and Cadence were the community project leads, and again, I think we can all probably look back at this and look at how not to engage a community. So if anyone's ever studying this, we've had quite a lot of universities reach out to us to actually understand what went wrong, and I think, rookie mistake, number one, you did not engage the community at their level. They came at it rather at a business level. They wanted to get a product, sell a product, and have us accept their product. Now, the public were really, really underestimated. Where I live, actually, the age demographic is a little bit older than myself. As to whether that was a reason that they chose an area, we're still yet to unpick that. But I think there was cavalier language used quite frequently of people reluctant to change, NIMBYs, all the rest of it. And I think it's always really important to actually understand that when this project was first put to our town, people were really excited. The language was used of green technology, this is the future, energy, we're going to be saving the planet, this is going to be a pioneering technology that you're going to be part of, and hey, you don't need to pay anything. So who's going to say no to that? And we all really started positively and wanting to go, right, okay, I think we're going to listen to this, we're going to come on board. But as the plans unfolded or the information was lacking, we actually reached out to the likes of Michael, Paul Martin, Tom Baxter, and numerous. If you follow Michael, you'll be familiar with a lot of these names, and Jan Rose now. We reached out to them going, we're not getting the information that we think we need to make an informed decision. And we were really fortunate that these people that are, really important, really busy people, spent their time to give us all of this information that you've seen. We've seen variations of that for about 2 years. And they brought us on a journey of knowledge and understanding. I work in a finance industry, in the banking sector. This is nothing to do with me on my daily life apart from when it was imposed on me. And I think, going back to what I was saying before, is there was a lot of the cavalier comments of people don't want to change. That is not the feeling I got from my community. They were really open to change. They wanted to change. They were really enthusiastic and optimistic that they could change or make a change for the future generations. Most of the people that surround me have got children, grandchildren. So for them, they thought they were going to be doing the right thing. But, I think, how can you make an informed decision if you're only being given one option? And all of the downsides of that one option are being kept away from you because you don't need to know. You're a consumer. We're the ones who will take away the technicals, and we'll deal with the detail. You don't need to. And I think, one thing that came out of our trial, actually, quite ironically, is we had quite a few different companies come and educate us on district heating and heat pumps, because we weren't saying no to the future. We were just saying, we're not sure about this. Could we have a look at what the other options might be? And we spent so much time, 18 months of our lives upskilling ourselves on technologies that, like I said, on a day-to-day basis, none of us really needed to know. But we did because we wanted to change. And I think one thing that came out of it is the community were really positive in the fact that if there was an opportunity to do a community district heating or community heat pump trial, then that is absolutely something that they would want to do. And going back to, 4x4-inch holes smashed into your wall for ventilation, doors being undercut. There was a variety of issues with these plans, between health and safety and cost. And I think, when it comes down to it, I didn't go to university, but I did not need to go to university or be well educated to understand that inputting 4 or 5 units of energy into a process and coming out with one is bad math, right? So if that's what it takes, and not only do I only get 1 unit at the end of it, I have to pay for that processing of the 4 or 5 units to start with. No, that does not sound like good economics to me. So I'll pass over to Tim.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Michael, as one of our visiting professors, giving the professors in the room an object lesson into how to hold an audience for 45, 50 minutes. Fantastic, thank you. In the usual way, I had a little list of things I thought I might say, most of which goes in the bin because you covered it or demolished it. A few things remain which I don't want to pick up on, which I thought were really interesting. So first is, what have we got to build? So we did a study a couple of years ago looking at how much renewables would we need to build in the UK to hit a 2035 net zero electricity system. We'd need to build 4 to 5 times as much wind as we presently have. That's an astonishing build rate in the next 15 years. And then you need the electrical transmission and distribution networks to support that. The other thing you need to do is build a lot of energy storage. That's interesting because you've got this variable renewables, you've got what people want to do. How do you match the two when famously electricity is a super perishable good? So you rely on energy storage to do some of that demand matching. You rely on demand-side response, as Greg eloquently talked about and has demonstrated. Or you trade internationally with your partners for when there's we might be short on power, they're long, etc. And the fourth leg of that is flexible generation. Now, I think, Michael, we know that you're not going to routinely burn hydrogen in gas turbines in order to balance electricity systems. You're going to rely on the other things. But then there comes the problem that you did touch on, which I thought was really interesting. How do you take that system through 20 days of persistent low wind speeds? It might not be 20 consecutive days, but 20 days in a couple of months. That's a lot of energy you've got to find from somewhere. There isn't a battery that's going to do that. There isn't a pumped hydro station that's going to do that. So what is it? It's a heck of a stretch for a compressed air storage system. So you're going to need a fuel, almost certainly, I would say, if I was putting my neck on the block. And then what is that? And I think that's where you offered some hope that that might be hydrogen uprated to e-methanol or similar. So you started with the Swiss Army knife, which I think is a lovely metaphor. Most of the bits fall off it through lack of use, and you end up with these things. The top row of your ladder, your famous ladder, and particularly the what we sometimes call Dunkelflaute, the wind drought situation. And then back to what I said about how much of that wind we build. That was just on electrifying vehicles and electrifying heating through heat pumps. We weren't factoring in some of those big industrial uses. So how much wind have we got to build? It is an enormous amount. And thank you, Kate. That was astonishing. Thank you. I come from a small village in Sussex, Bolcombe, which you've never heard of, unless you watched that. That's where Quadrilla did a test bore for fracking some years ago. And there were an awful lot of people objecting to that test bore, but they were open to things. And one of the things it stimulated, and it's a much smaller example than yours, was this community energy system that put PV on roofs of schools and farm-out buildings and so forth. So change is possible, just not always in the way that big business wants to push.
Okay. Thanks very much to the panel. We'll be open for questions, but let me just also make a comment at the start, right? So Michael knows I work in this area, and I wasn't offended, because actually I don't disagree with anything you said. So I've worked in hydrogen-related technologies for the last 40 years of my life, which is quite a lot of it now. And as a community, we can do ourselves a disservice. I think any technology can do itself a disservice if it markets itself in places where it's not well suited. And I think in recent years, and I've been through various waves of enthusiasm and despair, and then enthusiasm. And in all cases, I think the despair is unwarranted and the enthusiasm is overrated. And I think for those of us in the space, we have to also be honest about what technologies can do and where they play a role. And I do think there's a role to play, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further. I should also say, from an Imperial College perspective, and Tim is here and Harriet is here, who lead on our sustainability piece. So we have decided our new campus that we're building at the moment in White City will not have gas. It will be purely electric. Okay, interesting. We also have done the calculations. We know what we need to do to decarbonize the estate. We know how much it's going to cost. We also know that there isn't enough power to do it as things stand today. So there's some interesting challenges for us, and there's some interesting challenges for the economy as a whole, and Tim has also reflected on some of those numbers. So I'll shut up. We have a few minutes. There's lots of hands gone up, and I think what we might do, you've got the mic, let's take 2 or 3 questions and then let the panel reflect. This lady here was very quick. So if you could say who you are, where you're from, and what your question is quickly.
Sure.
Succinctly, I should say.
Is that working? Yep.
Yeah.
My name is Caroline Ashley. I'm from Steelwatch. I've just spent 2 days at the World Steel Open Forum in Brussels talking about steel, and I came back really depressed. Currently, the industry is roughly 2 billion tonnes of steel a year, 4 billion tonnes of CO2. And in the discussions, they thought they're only going to take 20% off that by 2040. They're still going to emit over 3 billion tonnes a year of CO2 because they're really negative about the pathway of green hydrogen for steel. And it's only on this second row of your ladder. But at the minute, there is no other way to reduce the iron, to take the oxygen out of the iron ore, apart from coal or green hydrogen. So I agree with all of the myths you have busted, and I used to have a job that was all criticise the hype, but now I have a job that is the steel industry needs green hydrogen or it is going to blow the carbon budget, 7% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm really curious as to why it's only on your second row, because I can't see we can reach a net zero economy unless steel decarbonises, and at the minute it needs green hydrogen, and the fact the hydrogen economy is tanking, as you rightly say for good reason, is actually hindering what we are trying to tell steel companies to do.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions, and then there was another hand, this lady over here. Yeah, and then we'll take you're coming to dinner now. You get your questions later. We'll take a question here, this gentleman. Go on.
Hi, Becca Yap, Charles River Associates. I work in energy consulting. I have a particular interest in heat pumps, given some projects I've been involved with. Greg, you mentioned how we kind of fall in for this story of hydrogen, but how do we tell a better story about the electrification of heat?
Okay, very succinct. Thank you very much. I know there's more questions, but I've picked my Karen, you're going to have to run over here. So this is energy and action. This gentleman in the grey sweatshirt. Thanks. So you can start to think about who wants to take the steel one.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, thank you. That was a great presentation, Michael. Thank you very much, and thank you for the panel. Building on that question as well, I study electrification of heat. And I think when you take a step back for the mass adoption of heat pumps and low carbon heating for the domestic sector in the UK, there's also a huge question around fabric improvement and retrofitting. Taking that down, there's a 7.5k subsidy as well for heat pumps, but that's still a big check when you look at both of those. So how are Octopus and how do you guys think as well, even from a community level, which is fascinating, do you think of this whole check together?
Okay, so we had 2 on heat, right? So let's take heat first. Do you want to go first, Greg? Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So the 2 questions on heat pumps.
Yeah.
Look, one of the things we have to recognize, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, it's what happens in every disruption of a technology, that the incumbents are fighting hard. And they're fighting hard both for cultural reasons, they just don't understand this stuff, and for commercial reasons. For 160 days in a row, one particular national newspaper carried negative stories about EVs. And they're doing the same with heat pumps, right? So to tell a positive story about heat pumps, you're swimming against a very powerful tide. But the good news is you have economics and physics on your side. I think the first thing is you don't have to be a heat pump fundamentalist. One trick of incumbents is they hold new technologies up to a level of perfection they don't themselves achieve. So I often hear heat pumps won't work in every home. I mean, I'm so sorry I can't swear, Nigel, because my goodness me.
Very good, very good. Keep going. Yeah.
In the UK, 20% of homes don't have gas. So, straight away, if you're comparing heat pumps to gas, they're probably more universal. But, we've got work to do. heat pumps are too expensive to buy, too expensive to install, and too expensive to run. Taking those one at a time. The hardware for heat pumps, like at the moment, the UK is a particularly challenging market because we tend to heat our homes with radiators. So we need heat pumps that will basically heat water, then pump it around a radiator circuit, as opposed to many other countries where you have direct air-to-air, which basically means air conditioning units are almost heat pump ready. Companies like ours have started investing in the manufacture, and already we're seeing the cost falling. So a commercial heat pump in the UK might at the moment, for a typical house, cost about £3,000 to buy. We can now make them for less than £2,000. We'll get that down to £1,500. We'll keep getting it down from there. You've also got a simpler distribution network. Currently, heat pumps, because they're a smaller industry, typically go through quite a lot of layers of distribution. Eliminating that and going direct, we can reduce the cost by 50% versus where it is today and more. When it comes to installation, another sort of policy error, I think, of the past was we had big subsidies to put heat pumps into complex, expensive houses, ones that were already hard to heat with gas. Right? 40% of UK people live in the typical sort of 3- and 4-bed semis. And they're almost heat pump ready. If they've got a water cylinder, we can do a like-for-like replacement on a heat pump in 2 days. And by the way, if we use a high-temperature heat pump, just using a different refrigerant, you don't need any change in radiators, piping, or insulation. It runs at the same flow temperature or higher than even the most inefficient gas boilers. And then on the running costs, essentially is again a policy perversity that electricity carries all of the carbon, all of the environmental and social levies. Gas, the fuel that is actually damaging the environment, it pays 20 times less tax in the UK. But even with that crippling taxation issue, it's already cheaper to run a heat pump in the vast majority of UK homes if you have it on any form of dynamic tariff. And I talked about the importance of understanding that earlier. So it's already becoming cheaper. I think we'll get to the point pretty soon where that £7,500 subsidy isn't needed. It might be 5 and then 2.5 for typical UK homes. And finally, heat pumps aren't the only solution. For those very few homes that aren't heat pump fixable, resistive heating as part of a full electrification will be far cheaper than any nonsense about using hydrogen to heat homes. And in between these, communal heating, district heating, and building heating with large ground source arrays and a variety of other solutions can really reduce costs very sensibly for a big swathe of UK housing. And between it, we've got better solutions. The really interesting is when people try it, they prefer it. So surveys show that 7 out of 10 people with a gas boiler are satisfied with their system, and 8 out of 10 with a heat pump. And the last bit of data, gas boilers are so bad that according to which the typical insurance policy for a gas boiler is more expensive than the typical insurance policy for a house in the UK.
Okay. Anyone would think you were a good salesman, but it's very impressive. And you are, but well, very clear as well. Okay, did you want to just add anything? No, okay. Steel? Michael, do you want to take the steel question?
I want to build steel as well.
Okay.
I wasn't going to do steel, just a couple of quick remarks on heat pumps. I think the high-temperature heat pump is a game changer. For all the horror stories that plumbers and others will come out with, you need to change every pipe in your house and every radiator. Largely nonsense in the first place, but high-temperature heat pumps help. And Nigel mentioned our plans for our campuses, challenging. Some of our buildings are listed and single-glazed and difficult. So we will have to use high-temperature heat pumps for some of them while we think about how we do deep refurbishment to drop the temperatures and still fit within the electricity demand limits we have in a central London location. So that building out of a electricity network, particularly in city centres, is going to be a challenge we have to face. And the last thing is, for these dense urban environments, there are options to think about. Looking for aquifers. There are aquifers under this part of London. That's a great source of heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. And there's a game changer. If you're thinking a bit about climate adaptation as well, you need to be thinking about how you cool your buildings in future. And the heat pump, the reversible heat pump, opens that up.
Okay, so plenty on heat. We won't take another heat question now, if you don't mind, but I'm going to come around with one more round of questions. But I do want Michael to talk about steel, which is indicative of some of the big, difficult industrial decarbonisation you'll need. You're mic'd up, of course you are. Okay, can you...
Yeah, so steel. So first of all, Caroline, it's great to see you in person. I'm an enormous fan of what you do at Steelwatch, so thank you for that. I think I guess I've never believed that the steel industry can decarbonize fully via hydrogen. So technical point on the ladder, row A is where you could sell hydrogen already because they already use it. So steel, everything on B is stuff that's promising. It's just not on A because it doesn't really exist yet. It's not using hydrogen today in any meaningful way. That's the only reason it's B, otherwise it'd probably be on A, right? But only, I think it's 4% of the ore in the world, the iron ore in the world, can be processed via DRI. So the idea that you're going to use hydrogen to decarbonize 2 billion tons of steel was fanciful to start with. Now, technology will improve and so on, but we've got to sort of keep realistic. And the problem you've got is just cost. It's not that you can't do it. They're doing this hybrid project. They are doing steel projects. And the only issue is cost. It's kind of almost like nothing that I have said. I'm not trying to sort of knock the legs out from underneath it. But, let's just get a heuristic on costs. A lot of these, strategies talk about million tons of hydrogen. Oman wants 1.3 million tons, and people want million tons of this and million tons of that. The Energy Ministerial said that we're going to have 90 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. The steel industry needs, I don't know how many, you certainly have the numbers, but it's millions of tons. Take 1 million tons of steel, that's 1 billion kilos. See, that's why I'm a visiting prof, right? Because I do the easy maths. So 1 billion kilos, and let's say you can crush down the cost of that hydrogen from 13 euros, whatever, and you can get it to, so that the penalty is only, let's call it 3 euros per kilo over grey or black hydrogen. So you've got 3 euros to find, but you've got to find it across 1 billion kilos, which means you've got a 3 billion annual cost. The problem is somebody's got to build the plants to produce that hydrogen, and they need at least a 10-year offtake. So you have to go to Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, for the next 10 minutes and ask him for 30 billion euros, pounds, dollars, if it's in those currencies, just to do 1 million tons. 30 billion has to be earmarked right now to do 1 million tons. So, I mean, yes, it's depressing, but this is not new news. They should have thought about this all along, that it's going to be expensive. Luckily, there are 5 ways of decarbonizing steel. If I can remember them, there's hydrogen, of course. There's direct reduction, Boston Metals, Fortescue Future Industries. If those are earlier TRLs, but hopefully they will work. And if they do, they kill hydrogen in steel. You could use biochar, you could use carbon capture, or you could just make your steel and go do BECCS, do offsets, do something somewhere else. 5 different ways. And in fact, there are 6 ways, because you could also not use steel. There are lots of substitutes. There's lots of steel being used, rebar that's being used when we could be using glass, right? There's lots of things that we could do. I used an RFJ, steel, in a bit of building, and I asked the builder if he was going to look into using fiberglass, and he said, no, mate, it's not a, sorry, I can't use that word, yacht. Right? So there's a lot that we can do to substitute. And there's actually, so I think that I'll stick with 6 different ways of avoiding the emissions from steel. And so I am optimistic, but it's not, only a piece of it, I think, will be done by hydrogen. So some of the other stuff had better work.
Okay, I'll take 2 more questions. Gentleman there first, and then let's go. The lady with the glasses on her head, just there. Yeah. So, gentlemen, be succinct, because we're already running over time, but I think there's enough interest to just run a few minutes over.
Thank you, Professor Nigel. Hello to everybody, and great lecture, Michael. My name is Yusuf Al-Shamari. I'm a graduate from Imperial College London, and I'm currently a consultant and an honorary senior fellow here. Your lecture was great, but don't you agree that the bars for the jump in the sales of electric vehicles were pretty much supported by subsidies, and half of that were in China? And the worst part actually is that they were actually powered by coal. So I believe that's possibly one possible reason why we did not see an increase in the fuel cell vehicles because of the politics. And another thing is, if the road to hydrogen, if someone listens to the lecture, is virtually blocked, and could the road to electricity is the way to move forward, and there is a supply chain constraints on metal. I'd like to hear your insight on that.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, right? That's two. And put your hand up again, so the lady over there, you're going to run. Yeah, well, right, all right, okay, this isn't a test of, this is like teamwork. Okay, right.
Thank you. My name's Olivia Ryan. I work at SSE Thermal, and we have a number of hydrogen projects. And I do agree with a lot of your lecture. That doesn't represent the view of the company, of course, but that there are lots of but truly there are lots of uses for hydrogen that are overhyped. But I wanted to touch more on the sort of storage and the long-term flexibility side of hydrogen, because that is one of the sort of niche uses for it that does genuinely have a future. So my question is more around how much do you think that the development of the other sort of, shall we say, supporting industries of uses for hydrogen and production of hydrogen, how much does that also help develop the sort of niche uses for it and the niche solutions?
Okay, thanks. So I think there's a question around supply chains. Having been to India a couple of times in recent times, I know that India is very passionate about hydrogen because it doesn't want to rely on Chinese battery suppliers. So there's a geopolitics piece here which perhaps defies efficiency. So question on supply chains, and then a question on storage, I think, or flexibility and the role of this, which I think you alluded to as one of the more positive cases. Do you want to pick those up, Michael?
Let me kick off on that. I mean, okay, so first, let me deal with the SSE and the niche. You call it the niche use. I think it could be quite a big niche to use some form of hydrogen or a derivative for long duration storage. And the answer is, yes, of course, it would require the production to become very cheap. But there is also there are a lot of people who use the need for long duration storage. They say we need to have hydrogen heating in Ellesmere Port and other places because of variability, right? Which is nonsense. Because if you gave me a salt cavern full of hydrogen and said, can you keep Kate's house warm? I would say, yeah, I'll generate electricity off it using perhaps a series power fuel cell. What a good idea, right? But I would put other stocks are available. But I would do the heating via electricity and a heat pump to keep that salt cavern as small as possible and to be as efficient as possible with capital. So to the point about, EVs are only successful because of subsidies, I'm going to be Yusuf I know very well, and he's been on my podcast, and he's an absolutely brilliant analyst, and I can get away with this. Dream on, right? This is exactly why, if you look at the countries that are having this slowdown in EVs, it is basically the countries that make small petrol and diesel cars. It's Italy, it's Germany, and they are simply trying to protect their, and Japan, they're trying to protect their internal combustion industry, and they will fail. Just look at this is supposed to be the slowdown year. It's only growing by 20%. Internal combustion engine cars peaked in 2017, have no chance of ever returning to growth. And the need for subsidies, as it did with solar, starts high and falls away. If you put some of your wonderful Saudi oil into a power station, generate electricity, and use it in an EV, that EV will drive further than putting the oil into the car, right? That is the transformation, and resistance is futile. Now, let me talk about the supply chain, because there is also an enormous amount of fake information being put out about this supply chain and the lack of minerals and so on and so on. So first of all, there is no shortage of minerals. There's a supply chain that needs to be built. The cure for high costs of minerals is high costs because people invest. Copper, when we first started mining it, 7,000 years ago, we were using ores that were 30% and 20%, and now we got down to 0.5%, 0.6%. The curve of output has always gone up, and the quality of ores has always gone down, and if we can't get enough copper, we'll use aluminum or aluminium, since we're here, and I've invested in a company called Magrathea Metals that's going to make magnesium out of salts, and that's going to substitute into aluminium or aluminum if you're over there. And one final thing on batteries, a fun fact or a fun thought, which I just find completely extraordinary. All of the forecasts for minerals assume, they rely on this fact that there's only 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled, which is false. Right? I did a fantastic episode of the podcast, Cleaning Up, with Mr. Mellin, Hans-Erik Mellin, the greatest expert. The number's already 90%. The 5%, go listen to the podcast, it's an extraordinary story. But here's the interesting thing. You mine some critical minerals, you put them in a battery. You use the battery for 10 years. You recover, let's say, 90%. You recover 90%, right? And then you make a new battery. And guess what? Technology has improved by more than 10%. So those minerals that you mined 10 years ago, next time round, they provide more energy service than they did before. And in 10 years' time, rinse and repeat. These are forever minerals. They provide the energy services for as long as we can improve technology faster than the losses in recovery, right? That is an astonishing thing, and it's completely missing from the life cycle carbon assessments. It's completely missing from the mineral requirement assessments. And all it takes is some fantastic academics to write a paper with me about this.
So, Michael, I think that's a fantastic note on which to end. Can we please thank Michael in particular, but all of the panelists for their contributions. Okay, so just to close, did we get a live stream? We did, okay. So there is a recording. It will be on the YouTube, Energy Futures Lab YouTube channel. Please do promote that to friends and colleagues. On the board here, on the screen, you can see the next briefing paper on the other completely non-controversial topic of nuclear challenges and opportunities. And again, that event can be attended in person or via live stream, so please do consider attending that. We do have a reception outside, so please do join us for a drink if you have time to do so. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you very much.